Hey everybody, it's Dr. Jensen. You made it! Module 6. So this is the last module of the class. We're going to be doing chapters 9, 10, and 11. A lot of what happens here is a review of things we've done, plus some new material where we talk about social media, we talk about the dark net, and a lot of other really cool stuff. So I think this is a fun way to end the class and get some closure on all this really interesting stuff we've done all semester. So let's get started. First, we'll introduce Chapter 9 to you and talk about slaying make-believe monsters. We'll then talk about the criminal justice system conceptualizations that are out there, and this is the work of Herbert Packer. And then finally, we'll talk about how the media portrayal of those concepts may affect public perception. So let's jump in. So first, policy is shaped around the public perception of crime. Remember, it's not reality that truly matters, it's your perception of reality that matters. Okay, so it's really how you take in and process all these ideas that are presented to you that informs your thinking, your behavior, and your emotions. Okay, so what's the media portrait of crime look like? Well, we know this already from class. There are predatory offenders out there waiting to pounce on you and kill you, and they're terrible, horrible, monstrous people, and that represents all criminals. We also have the portrait of everything is a violent crime. We know that most crime is not violent. So that's not backed up by evidence or science. And that there's this continuous battle of good versus evil, and no one ever wins, and that, you have to have your guard up at all times. You have to be very defensive in nature. That really rehabilitation is completely useless. You can never rehabilitate a criminal. They can never be made a productive member of society, so why try? And that essentially corrections are ineffective. This kind of pushes people into some of the extreme thinkings out there where we should punish everything with a life sentence and we should execute every criminal, and it gets pretty out there sometimes. So essentially we have media portraits that really kind of underscore these ideas very profoundly. So essentially, anything that's not punitive is naive, right? If it doesn't punish the criminal or separate them from society to keep them from offending, then it's naive at best. It's a lost cause. With all this going on, that's how it is. So essentially, how does media content influence criminal justice policy? Well, very strongly, as you just saw. First, we're going to talk about two models that Surratt brings up, and these are models by Herbert Packer. And the work of Herbert Packer is used throughout the study of criminology and criminal justice, so you've probably seen this before. But the first perspective is the due process model, and as you might guess, its focus is on due process. So the criminal justice system is seen as an obstacle course in which the government must prove an accused person's guilt while conforming to strict procedural rules. So essentially, it's really about the rights and about the process. So the most important thing in this model is the protection of citizen rights, prevention against arbitrary and capricious government action, and procedural justice. That, jury of your peers, a fair and impartial jury, a speedy trial, making sure that arrests are legal, that evidence is legally obtained, that the judge is there to call balls and strikes during the trial. So legal guilt, as it is defined, is really the key determination of what happens to a person. And of course, this is decided at the end of a long process. So let's talk about some examples that this includes. So this is why we have things like the exclusionary rule, okay? The exclusionary rule is a guideline that talks about searches and seizures, and law enforcement use this all the time. It essentially prohibits the use of illegally obtained evidence in a criminal trial. So it kind of safeguards your privacy rights against police just coming in and taking all your stuff and going through everything without your consent, okay? We also have due process examples like reasonable suspicion, all right? So determining the legality of a police officer's decision to perform a search. So they have to have things like plain view, getting consent from you, and some other types of things. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more to make it more clear and think about how media has informed these ideas. We also have things like the use of warrants and the establishment of probable cause. So these things would be very in line with due process, against safeguarding rights, against arbitrary government intervention or application. Now on the other side of the model, you have the crime control side, right? So this is where the criminal justice system is perceived as an assembly line, along which defendants should be processed as quickly and efficiently as possible. It's just bop, bop, bop. That's how it works. So what are the most important things in this model? Essentially detecting and punishing criminals. So it's all about investigation and about getting them into prison, right? Deterring future crime by showing that we are tough on crime. You don't really get reelected by being soft on crime. It's hard to do that. Being tough on crime gets you more votes generally. And then again, keeping the public safe. Those are the key important values here. And so factual guilt is the key determination. Whether it's legal guilt, that's something else. And this is decided at the beginning of the process. And it's assembly line justice. It really has a lot to do with punishment. So some examples for this would be things like imminent threat, where we might be willing to forfeit some of our personal rights and our privacy rights because of an emergency going on, terrorist attacks, active shooter, where maybe we're treated differently because of these kinds of emergencies. Stop and frisk, police stops and searches. We also have lots of laws out there, and this varies from state to state, on standing your ground, defending your castle, or duty to retreat. So this places limits on self-defense or engages people in self-defense as a right to go against the criminal. You also have things like 3 strikes laws, which a lot is said out there in a lot of criminology classes, so let's just be completely clear what we mean by 3 strikes laws and not assume that you know exactly what they are. Essentially, a 3 strikes law increases the prison sentence of a person convicted of a felony who have been convicted previously of 2 or more violent crimes or serious felonies, and it also limits the ability of these offenders to receive a punishment other than a life sentence. So it's a highly restrictive, highly punitive set of laws. It also influences something that we might call mandatory minimum sentencing. Okay, and this is very common with drug offenses. If you have this much of the drug, you're going to get at least 5 years. If you have this much of the drug, you're going to get at least 10 years, and so on and so forth, because we think it determines your intent to distribute or your intent to deal or the number of people's lives you might be affecting. So the more you have, the more punitive we get. And mandatory minimums essentially are kind of that swift assembly line justice. If it fits the criteria, you get this punishment, and that's how it is. So these are just different ways to think about how media has pushed us into more of a due process side or a crime control side. And we kind of go back and forth, and you can see the tension between these two sides definitely there. So when we think about slaying make-believe monsters and maybe using more due process or crime control, you can use these models by Packer to really understand the effect of media on criminal justice policy. So we have these conflicting perceptions of the criminal justice system that arise out of different media portrayals of the criminal justice system. So sometimes, again, we have conflicts within the paradigms. Is criminal justice effective versus ineffective because of the due process approach? Or is it effective or ineffective because of the crime control approach? Now think about what you've already learned. The pretrial publicity stuff, that would all go into that due process side. The corrections and crime fighters stuff, that would all go into the crime control side. Okay, so again, we have a demand for both, but you can't have your cake and eat it too. So sometimes we lean more on one side versus another, because what you gain in rights and privacy, you tend to forfeit in safety. What you gain in safety and crime control, you tend to forfeit in rights and privacy. So it has this inverse relationship and this pendulum swing that goes back and forth all the time. So based on what's portrayed, the public's perception of what's needed in policy might be different. So as you might expect, when you look at different decades, different media, different celebrity criminal cases, different high pretrial publicity cases, different films that are blockbuster films where criminal justice is front and center, you can see how this actually does shape policy. We're going to look at some of the research that shows you how this happens. So we're going to stop here, but we'll pick up where we left off in the next lecture, and we'll see you then.